Okay, students, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. This is our lecture number 11 on the topic of literary forms and movements. The topic of today's discussion is transcendentalism. Students, in today's lecture we are going to discuss the general information of transcendentalism, liberal New England, Congregationalists, utilitarians, Frederick Henry Hayes, James Marsh and Emerson. Students, transcendentalism is an American literary, philosophical, religious and political movement of the early 19th century centered around Ralph Waldo Emerson. Other important transcendentalists were Henry David Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, Lydia Maria Child, Amos Branson Alcott, Frederick Henry Hayes, Elizabeth Palmer, and Theodore Parker. Students, these are the scholars from England, Germany, and America. Students, the transcendentalists pleaded with the sense that a new era was at hand. They were critics of their contemporary society for its unthinking conformity and urged that each person find in Emerson's words an original relation to the universe. Students, Emerson and Thoreau sought this relation in solitude between nature and its writings. By the 1840s, they, along with other transcendentalists, were engaged in the social experiments of Brooke, Form, and Walden. And by the 1890s, in an increasingly urgent critique of American slavery. Students, what we now know as transcendentalism first arose among the liberal New England Congregationalists who departed from orthodox Calvinism in two respects. First, they believed in the importance and efficacy of human striving as opposed to the bleaker Puritan picture of complete and inaccessible human depravity. Students, second, and they emphasized the unity rather than the Trinity of God, hence the term utilitarian, originally a term of abuse, what they came to adopt. Most of the utilitarian students hold that Jesus was in same way inferior to God, the Father, but still greater than human beings. A few followed the English utilitarian Joseph Priestley in holding that Jesus was thoroughly human, although endowed with special authority. The utilitarian's leading preacher, William Ellery Channing, portrayed orthodox Congregationalism as a religion of fear and maintained that Jesus saved human beings from sin, not just from punishment. His sermon, Utilitarian Christianity, denounced the conspiracy of ages against the liberty of Christians and helped give the utilitarian movement its name. In likeness to God, he proposed that human beings partake of divinity and that they may achieve a growing likeness to the Supreme Being. Students, the utilitarians were modern. They attempted to reconcile Locke's empiricism with Christianity by maintaining that the accounts of miracles in the Bible provide overwhelming evidence for the truth of religion. Students, it was precisely on this ground, however, that the transcendentalists found fault with utilitarianism. For although they admired training ideas that human beings can become more like God, they were persuaded by Hume that no empirical proof of religion could be satisfactory. In letters written in his freshman year to Harvard, Emerson tried out Hume's skeptical arguments on his devout and respected Aunt Mary Moody Emerson, and in his journals of the early 1820s, he discusses with approval Hume's dialogues on natural religion and his underlying critique of necessary connection. Students, we have no experience of a creator. Emerson writes, and therefore we know of none. Students, skepticism about religion was also engendered by the publication of an English translation of F.D.E. critical essay upon the Gospel of St. Luke, which introduced the idea that the Bible was a product of human history and culture. Students, equally important was the publication in 1833, some 50 years after his initial appearance in Germany, of James Marsh's translation of John Gottfried von Herder's Spirit of Hebrew Poetry. Herder blurred the lines between religious texts and humanly produced poetry, casting doubt on the authority of the Bible, but also suggesting that texts were equal authority could still be written. Students, it was against this background that Emerson asked in 1836, in the first paragraph of Nature, why should we not have a poetry and philosophy of insight and not of tradition, and a religion by revelation to us and not the history of theirs, the individual's revelation or intuition, as Emerson was later to speak of it, was to be the counter both to utilitarian empiricism and human skepticism. Students, an important source for the transcendentalists' knowledge of German philosophy was Friedrich Henry Hegel. Hegel's father, Levi Hegel, a Harvard professor of logic, sent him to preparatory school in Germany at the age of 13, after which he attended the Harvard Divinity School. Ordained as a Unitarian minister, Hegel wrote a long review of the work of Samuel Taylor Coleridge for the Christian Examiner in 1833. Students, nothing Coleridge's fondness for German metaphysics and his immense gifts of erudition and expression, he laments that Coleridge had not made Kant and the post-Kantians more accessible to an English-speaking audience. This is the task to introduce the transcendental philosophy of Kant that Hegel takes up. In particular, he explains Kant's Copernican revolution in philosophy. Since the supposition that our intuitions depend on the nature of word without will not answer, assume that the word without depends on the nature of an intuitions. This key to the whole critical philosophy, Hegel continues, explains the philosophy of a priori knowledge. Students, Hegel organized what eventually became known as the Transcendental Club by suggesting to Emerson in 1836 that they form a discussion group for disaffected young Unitarian clergy. The group included George Ripley and Branson Alcott, had some 30 meetings in 4 years, and was a sponsor of the Dial and Brooke form. Hedge was a focal opponent of slavery in the 1830s and a champion of women's rights in the 1850s, but he remained a Unitarian minister and became a professor at the Harvard Divinity School. Students, another source for the transcendental knowledge of German philosophy was Germain de Stael, whose books were a favorite of the young Emerson. In a sweeping survey of European metaphysics and political philosophy, the scholar praises Locke's devotion to liberty, but sees him as the originator of a sensationalist school of epistemology that leads to the skepticism of Hume. He finds an attractive contrast in German tradition that begins in Kant, asserts the power of authority of the mind. Students, Jim Marsh, a graduate of Andover and the president of the University of Vermont, was equally important for the emerging philosophy of transcendentalism. Students, Marsh was convinced that German philosophy held the key to a reformed theology. His American edition of Coleridge's Aids to Reflection introduced Coleridge's version, much indebted to Schelling, of Kantian terminology that runs throughout Emerson's early work. In Nature, for example, Emerson writes, "The imagination may be defined to be the use with the reason makes of the material world." Students, German philosophy and literature was also championed by Thomas Carlyle, whom Emerson met on his first trip to Europe in 1831. In 1831, Carlyle's philosophy of action in such works with Emerson, of action in works with Emerson's idea in The American Scholar that action along with nature and the mind of the past, essential to human education. Along with his countrymen Coleridge and Wordsworth, Carlyle embraced a natural supernaturalism, the view that nature, including human beings, has the power and authority traditionally attributed to an independent deity. Students, piety towards nature was also a main theme of William Wordsworth, whose poetry was in vogue in America in the 1820s. Wordsworth's depiction of an active and powerful mind cohered with the shaping power of the mind that his collaborator in the lyrical ballads, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, traced to Kant. Students, the idea of such power pervades Emerson's Nature, where he writes of nature as obedient to spirit and counsels each of us to build your own. Wordsworth has his more deceptive mood as well, in which he calls for a heart that watches and receives. And we find Emerson's deceptive mood from nature onward, and when he recounts on ecstatic experience in the words, "Friends, I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all the current of the universal being circulate through me." Students, Emerson sense that men and women are, as he put in Nature, gods in ruins, led to one of the transcendentalism's defining events. His delivery of an address at the Harvard Divinity School graduation in 1838, Emerson portrayed the contemporary church that the graduates were about to lead as an Eastern monarchy of the Christianity that had become an injurer of man. Jesus, in contrast, was a friend of man, yet he was just one of the true race of prophets, whose message is not so much their own greatness as the greatness of man. Students, Emerson rejects the Unitarian arguments that miracles prove the truth of Christianity, not simply because the evidence is weak, but because proof of this sort they envision embodies a mistaken view of the nature of religion. Conversion by miracles is a profanation of the soul. Emerson's religion is based not on testimony but on a perception that produces a religious sentiment. Students, the Divinity School address drew a quick and angry response from Andrew Norton of the Harvard Divinity School, often known as the Unitarian Pope. In the New School in Literature and Religion, Norton complains of a restless craving for notoriety and excitement, which he traces to German speculatists and barbarians and that hyper-Germanized Englishman. Carlyle Emerson's address, he concludes it at once an insult to religion and an incoherent idea. Students, an earlier transcendentalist scandal surrounding the publication of Branson's Alcott's Conversations with Children upon the Gospels. Alcott was a self-taught educator from Connection who established a series of schools that aimed to draw out the intuitive knowledge of children. He found anticipations of his views about a priori knowledge in the writings of Plato and Kant and sport in college. The idea that idealism and materiality could be reconciled. Students, Alcott replaced the hard benches of the common schools with more comfortable furniture than that he built himself and left a central space in his classrooms for dancing. The Conversations with Children upon the Gospels, based on a school Alcott ran in Boston, argued that evidence for the truth of Christianity could be found in the unimpeded flow of children's thought. What people particularly noticed about Alcott's book, however, were its frank discussions of conception, criticism, and childbirth. Rather than gaining support for his school, the publication of the book caused many parents to withdraw their children from it, and the school, like many of Alcott's projects, failed. Okay, students, you may ask any questions regarding transcendentalism in our coming lecture. Okay, students, see you in next lecture.